Can't be more ready than now.
Wow, sure, exactly. Okay, cześć.
That's terrible. Cześć.
I don't give a fuck.
Cześć.
Okay, now in English. So I'm with Carmac here. How do you pronounce your name? It looks like Michael, but I hear everyone saying something else.
Michael is completely fine. It's the perfect English equivalent of Michał.
Michał, okay. So I'm here with Carmac, and even though now you're known as like, you were, what are you now at the moment? You were the ESL product manager before for IEM. What's your current title?
Managing Director Pro Gaming.
Okay, so but originally you got your start as a journalist.
Yeah.
Now, when we say journalist, people are going to think of like the modern context, even of an esports journalist, okay, like salaried, go to all the events, interviews, photos. But originally, journalism just literally meant like putting things online, a column, even just new posts, very simple things. When you started out, did you think like, I am a journalist, I want to be a journalist, this is what I want to do? What were you thinking in the early days?
I actually, if somebody would, let's say, if somebody would tell the 18-year-old me, you would become a journalist, I would say it's impossible, because that was never an interest of mine, ever. And I started out at, I just wanted to talk about video games. I thought I had something to say, and I found a website in ES Reality, or XS Reality back then, which allowed me to express myself, and I found that I enjoyed it. And I don't think anybody from that era was thinking of him or herself as a journalist, actually. We're just putting stuff out, and we had no clue what we were doing, like from today's perspective, in terms of how you should structure it, a news post even, or what title you need to give it, or something like that. That was all terrible back then, but there was lots of people like me, and all of us had passion to do something. And it seems like in these days, actually, people are waiting for a handout before they actually write a single headline, which is probably not the way to start your esports adventure.
The earliest things you were doing was in Unreal Tournament. There was like different sections of XS. So it was all in Unreal Tournament initially.
Yeah.
And you were writing just columns. And so nowadays people would think of that as like editorial almost. They were just opinion pieces. How would you characterize the early stuff? What type of tone did you have? What type of stuff?
So in the beginning, I was actually, the first pieces I wrote were actually, I don't remember the first thing I wrote. A couple of news items for sure. And I think an article about the Danish UT scene.
Okay.
For some reason, I'd met some Danish UT players, and I thought maybe it would be interesting for the people to read about the Danish UT scene. I think. I might not even be correct. So it was all relatively kind of discovery, and sharing that discovery with other people. So that was the very first kind of stuff that I would write.
There's a cliche that everyone repeats in esports about the earliest games that you play. And people claim that whatever the first game that you play in esports, like the first really good title, you'll always like hold that higher than the others, or you'll nostalgically think, oh, that was the best. Like other games were good, but that was the absolute best. So most people, even in modern day, might actually think you started with Quake. But like I said, you actually start with Unreal Tournament. And for people who like Quake, Unreal Tournament is like shit.
Garbage, they would say, yeah.
Does Carmac still believe Unreal Tournament was better than Quake? It was the best, that it was my favorite still?
It is my favorite game. Because at the end of the day, it's kind of like with certain dishes, right? If there's Koreans with kimchi, there's no better kimchi than the way Mama made it. So if you spend your youth actually trying to study every single aspect of a game, and you begin to understand it on a level where maybe 1% of the people do, because you've spent so much time thinking about all the intricacies and coming up with tricks and ways to get control of the map, regain control of the map, be stealthy, all of these things, it becomes, you begin to value those little tricks and those little things that you can do specifically in this one game. and you really learn to enjoy them because you've discovered them yourself at the time. So I would assume actually that this is the reason why people, most gamers would say, hey, this game is my love, this is my original game. Over time I learned to appreciate different games as well. I mean, Quake is a fantastic game, and frankly speaking I think it's apples and oranges, Quake versus Unreal Tournament. Because they both require, both FPS games, both deathmatch games, but they require different skill sets completely. But if I were to whine, UT these days, the original has deteriorated because some idiot on the internet decided to fix the game, and some of the bugs which were accepted as standard and were part of the gameplay are now removed, completely rebalancing the game in terms of weapon versus weapon, and making it very, very point and clicky, very insta-gibby these days, and that's something I don't like in a game.
So you said that you kind of drew a relative perspective there, like, okay, you like Quake, Unreal was your favorite, maybe it was the original one, but you kind of made a point there to make us all like, it's not like one's better, they both have their own qualities. So, okay, explain this to me then, because there's a lot of Quake people might watch this interview. What was good about Unreal Tournament? What were the things that were different from Quake that you think had merit, or maybe people didn't understand? Because I will agree, if people saw the movement in Unreal Tournament, for example, which was like very jagged and sharp, people who are used to the smooth inertia of Quake would go, oh, that's terrible, without even knowing. Were the merits to this? Was there things that you could do that you think had value in an esports game?
Absolutely. I think the main difference is that, and I'm comparing to Quake 3, a game I'm quite intimate with, or as intimate as you can be without being a really good player in it. The weapons in Unreal Tournament are absolutely overpowered, all of them, whereas Quake has them toned down. So it's this balance by nerfing versus balance by overpowering.
Okay.
And I prefer balance by overpowering in video games, and I think anybody that played Quake 1, a game I'm not intimate with, but the noises I keep hearing from these people is that what's good about Quake World is that all the weapons are overpowered actually. It's that lack of balance which makes it great. Unreal Tournament has that. I mean, sniper rifle, 2 shots you deal 300 damage potentially, and that's in 7/10 of a second that you can deal it. Flak cannon, straight up, if you hit everything to the face, it deals, I think, 340 damage or something like that. Shock combo, if you hit it direct, it's insane damage. I mean, so you could really, games could swing very, very quickly, and you can come back from behind control if you're really intelligent and had really good positioning, because most weapons would actually, you could get advantage through positioning. And something that the Quake players don't enjoy, for example, the charged up rockets, which is lame because it deals so much damage. It actually can be extremely tactical. If you can read somebody really well, you can pull off amazing stuff. I hit a guy once, incidentally the best Polish player ever, mid-air with centered, you can center the 5 rockets, they didn't have to go like that. With centered 5 rockets mid-air, predicted as he fell down. And I actually, of course it's a relatively big gamble, but I actually managed to hit that. And there's so much you can do with thought alone in terms of use of the weapons that you simply can't do in Quake. And you mentioned the movement. The dodging aspect is completely different and very wild in Unreal Tournament, where you can really quickly dodge in all directions, and that actually makes a big difference. So you can actually, if you use terrain, if you dodge off of a ledge, you travel quite far. You change the distance of between you and your opponent. actually forcing him to do a weapon switch, because you instantly render his weapon less effective by pulling that maneuver off. And he had to either settle for a more difficult mouse motion with the aiming because of the changed distance, or he would have to go for a weapon switch, which then allowed you to either escape or continue the fight, go back into the fight, while he's switching the weapon, where the weapon switch is slower than in Quake, a little bit slower than in Quake. So it does have its own merits. I can understand how somebody that grew up playing Quake feels that it's lame, because that's totally not. It's like basketball versus handball. You know, if you love basketball, you're not going to fall in love with handball, even though the skills are theoretically similar, comparable, if that makes any sense.
So even though this is going to be a hypothetical question, if for some reason you didn't encounter Unreal Tournament first, let's say instead you encountered Quake 3. I mean, actually, famously, the Polish scene uniquely all played CPM, this pro mod version, which was like very rarely played in other parts of the world. So it's possible you could have encountered that scene. There was like a LAN scene, it would have been cool, I imagine. Do you think it was something about Unreal Tournament particularly that drew you into that game? Did you just find a new game and you adapted to all the peculiarities of Unreal Tournament? Would you have become a Quake player initially, you think, if that's the first game you encountered?
The first game I actually encountered was Quake 2.
Okay.
But I never played it long enough or well enough to begin to appreciate that kimchi factor.
Okay.
So I didn't learn to kind of, oh, this is skill for me. This is what I think skill is in an FPS game. And then it was just, in Poland there were internet cafes. Internet was really bad, so you played on LAN mostly. And I was aware of Quake, and I tried a little bit of Quake. But then I just popped into an internet cafe which my friends visited, and it was Unreal Tournament. That was the game in that particular place. And that's what everyone played. That's it. There's no... there was a chance that I could have become a Quake player, but honestly I think I would have become a worse Quake player than I was a UT player.
Nowadays, Unreal Tournament, even though early on it wasn't as big as Quake, but it had a similar position, okay? It was maybe like second or third or fourth in the esports world, especially in Europe because of clan-based and stuff. Nowadays, the history of the Unreal Tournament stuff hasn't translated at all, partly because it doesn't have a legacy that continues in the same way as Quake Live does or something. And so if I asked modern day people, they couldn't even name who the best duel player is. Now in your era, when you were doing this, there was this guy called Gitz, this German player. Was he really comparable to a Rafa, a Cypher, but of Unreal Tournament? Was there that level of competition possible?
Absolutely. He was hands down the best.
What was he the best at?
I think if I were to use the modern terminology, I think mechanically he played the game beautifully. He simply was perfect mechanically at the time for the ability, for the hardware that was available, and for the development of the skills. He was mechanically perfect, and he was very, very, very good tactically. Maybe not the best. He was kind of German in that sense. If you know what I mean, that I'm using a stereotype. The stereotype of Germans, you know, kind of like the soccer team of Germany. They don't really have a reputation for flair, but they're extremely efficient, solid. He was really, really sound tactically and beautiful, played the game beautifully on a mechanical level.
Because as we do this discussion, when we come into the part about the ESL period, at this point you have some say over rule sets, okay? And so I had a question, a way of relating a rule set difference that you and I have back to Unreal Tournament.
Okay.
So in Unreal Tournament, there was a very famous tournament, World Cyber Games. I think it was 2002 perhaps. And what happened was, Gitz was the best player, but maybe the second best player was this guy from the Netherlands called Lauke. And, you know, he should win the silver medal, okay, this year. This tournament was actually double elimination format, I believe. And from what I remember, in one of the games, he actually got upset by this guy from the UK called Shaggy, who actually wasn't someone who should have won the silver medal or whatever he won. I think it was the silver. And so
he won silver.
in theory, this was a total upset, and it wasn't double elimination.
It was. I'll tell
Okay.
you a little secret. I mean, it used to be taboo, but I used to play practice games online with Shaggy, and
Okay.
I'd beat him maybe 40% of the time. And I beat Lauke one time in my life. Once. On a map. So it was a major upset.
Because my question is, even though that tournament was double elimination, they only played once as far as I know. Like, I think Lauke maybe lost to Gitz first or something, and then he was expected to beat Shaggy, whatever the order was. Well, I know you're a huge proponent of single elimination. You don't think double elimination is good, or you don't think it's appropriate for modern day esports tournaments. This is what I've seen you say in many interviews. In that sort of a scenario, in theory, in another type of double elimination tournament, maybe those two people could meet again, okay? So maybe the upset happens, because it's so unlikely, you meet again, and now odds play out, you'd figure the Lauke guy would win, okay? In single elimination, let's say those two players had met in the semi-final, and the Lauke guy loses, and the other guy wins. Now, if that's like the biggest tournament ever, this guy gets to come second, he gets all that prize money, he gets all the acclaim, and this guy sort of gets shifted a bit just for one bad game. Is this not a problem with single elimination? You don't mind that at all?
Problem with single elimination is, to me, is seeding. If you have seeding, I believe in World Cyber Games you had completely random groups at the time.
So, yeah.
And completely random groups can give you a random bracket. So that's the major problem for me. The reason I dislike double elimination is that mathematically, if you and I are 50-50% in skill, disregarding psychology or anything, if we sit down to a double elimination final and you have to beat me twice, you have a mathematical shot of 25% to win. In reality, if we are like 55-45, that 25% shrinks to, I don't know, 15-17% in a final. And that's not a final I want to watch because I get the feeling that it's a foregone conclusion as a viewer. Some finals have famously turned out with lower bracket winner winning, but I don't think as a tournament organizer I want to pay for that one weekend of excitement with 7 or 8 tournaments where the guy who's supposed to win is winning, if that makes any sense. That's one reason I dislike double elimination for. The other is that really it reminds me of watching soccer games in the Champions League when you have 2 legs, where if you have 2 legs and let's say Real Madrid is playing Manchester United and one of the teams beats the other 2-0 in the first leg, it's not so dramatic, and you don't really, if you're cheering for Manchester United, Manchester loses, it's not so dramatic that they lost 2-0 because there is a percentage of a chance that they will come back. So it's not, your emotions are not heightened by that score as much as they would be if it was the only game. And in the second leg, you're not as excited as you would be because you're thinking, it's a tall order to beat Real Madrid in Madrid 2-0 and try to equalize it. And yes, it happens, and when it does, it's very exciting and you jump up and down and emotions really go very high. But most of the time, actually, if you think about it, it doesn't. So I see this first and second leg, let's say psychological thing, in double elimination where, oh, Lauke is being knocked out by this English guy. But it's a fluke, it doesn't matter. Lauke will come back through the lower bracket. And you're not really as excited. And in the lower bracket, me personally, I think, oh, he's in the lower bracket, so he's not even going to win the tournament anyway. So I'm not that excited by lower bracket games. So I think it's to a large extent a very psychological thing when it comes to producing a show. So you really have to balance when you design a tournament. You really have to balance the quest to find the best player and decide: do you want to find the number 1, number 2, number 3, number 4, number 5 correctly? Or do you want to find the number 1 and deliver a great show to people? That's a conscious equation that you have to balance. I concede that double elimination is better than single in finding the number 1, 2 down to 5, 6, 7. But I'm not sure if people want to know if this guy is really the number 5 of that tournament. I'm not sure if that question is that relevant. So if somebody chooses double elimination, I can understand why. I just outlined why I choose single.
Because this leads into a topic on the idea of single elimination, something you said there, which is that seeding is very important. Because obviously you don't want the 2 best players to play in the round of 8 if possible. Now, unfortunately, the current method of seeding comes internally from the tournament, which is that you have group stages, and then who comes first plays someone second. And so you have sort of a seeding to keep people who are better apart from each other. But actually, I've never heard anyone address this. This is why I want to ask you, since you're in a position to make these decisions, you know. What you're essentially doing there is a group stage usually is quite small sample size. Like maybe some groups in some games you play someone once. In some groups you play a best of 3 or whatever. So you're actually determining how the whole bracket to the final, which might be best of 7, is ranked based on maybe 1 map or maybe just 2 maps that you win out of a best of 3. That can determine the whole bracket. Now, if you were going to say this was a real sport, okay, so one of my favorite sports is actually single elimination. It's tennis. Tennis probably has the most perfect seeding ever, because they have a world ranking and that's just how it works. And so as a result, if I'm the number 1 player and you're the number 3 player, then we will only meet at a certain point in the tournament every time.
Yeah.
We can never meet in the round of 16 and I knock you out and then people say, oh, you're the 17th best player. No, you can, as long as you keep winning and I'm eating, we're always going to meet at that spot, okay? So the bizarre thing to me is, what do you think about this point I make there, that you're essentially determining the most important part of the tournament by the least important? Like, would you agree with that in any sense on how the group decides the rest of the bracket? Because if I have one bad game here and I'm the second best, then I might play the best in the first round.
So the answer is a bit of a yes and a bit of a no, in the sense that we are dealing with environments where we typically have maybe 3 days to finish a whole tournament.
Okay.
And there's no good way to really, ideally we'd probably play best of 5s group play, or, extend, make sure that the seeding, or run a double group play with 32 players. That's probably my favorite system actually, because there's a double 2 layers of actually natural seeding of who's good on the weekend. Yeah. Not like, okay, the number 1 guy has, he had problems at home, girlfriend dumped him, he's down in the gutter, he hasn't prepared a lot at all, but he's the number 1 in the ranking. This weekend he isn't, he's probably number 16 in the world. But in Wimbledon you can be Federer, you have a bad day, you drop out. Actually, the best possible system theoretically is to have a large number of players and go through 2 group stages, because that's a very natural seeding based on skill only, and skill on this weekend rather than skill over the course of the last year, where actually the skill today is the most relevant factor for potentially for seeding, if we speak in theoretical terms. So if I had the time to run tournaments like that, that's probably how I would run tournaments. And I agree, it's a trade-off. It's not perfect. It's an imperfection which you mention in tournament systems, where we have to, at some point, and everybody does. DreamHack, for example, does best of 3 in playoffs. I don't think as a competitor I would like it, but they have 2 days to complete a tournament most of the time. So they have to make choices somewhere. And they have large brackets as well, like really large numbers of players. Yeah. So these are all choices which have trade-offs here or there, and you have to think about what your underlying priorities are to figure out where you make these trade-offs, what you are willing to sacrifice, and what you want to gain. You need to think of the strategy, where you want to go with the tournament. And frankly speaking, coming from an environment where I was a competitor in judo, where it was probably the cruelest tournament system you could have, where you fight, you lose a match, you lose a bout, and sometimes you go home with no second chance. You only have a repechage chance if you lose to somebody who got into the semi-final.
Yeah, yeah.
Then you have a repechage chance. So sometimes you travel, 8 hours after training for a quarter of a year towards a tournament, travel throughout the whole country, you fight, you lose, and then you go home, another 8 hours home. So I come from that world, and I've learned to accept that type of cruelty in a tournament system. Is it perfect? No, but it's a choice we have to make. And cruelty, sometimes the cruelty of tournament systems is actually the source of the beauty in it.
In what sense?
In the sense that it's something Matthew Dallon said, the ESWC, the guy that made ESWC happen. You only get the true championness of a player, if you will, if you put him at the edge, at the very edge. And I agree with him to some extent that the true champion, I think you will agree, anybody would, the true champion comes out at the greatest challenge, when he's facing the greatest challenge possible. Double elimination with a thought in the back of your head, or another system where you have a thought in the back of your head that you have a second shot, second chance, second go at it. That's very far from the ultimate challenge. So in that sense, the sense, the player sensing a challenge, or that stress of, holy shit, I'm about to be out. Do I cheese now, or do I play it safe? Because I don't have a second shot. The spectators thinking the same, the commentators thinking the same. That creates that little spark that's so difficult to produce in any form of entertainment. That's what I like. That's my philosophy of esports. And I value that equally with the quest for the number one guy. And I value it above the quest to find who the second guy is.
Okay.
I prefer to have a show which everybody will remember, and an exhilarating experience for the champion over finding who really the second guy was. If the real second place finisher, the second best guy at that weekend, lost in the semi-final to the champion, I am accepting that.
Because I have a similar point to make about qualification systems, and almost the same exact point I'm going to draw, which is that you prefer a system of qualification that's 100% open. And so in theory, tomorrow I can sign up, and if you have another IEM qualifier, I can play online. I'll start in this huge grid. I think it's maybe 500 players. I forget how many, depending on the size of the qualifier. And if I win all the matches, and I beat Grubby, and I beat whoever else, I'll be in the next IEM, okay? And I'm not a professional player. Now, I can see a good aspect to this, which is a famous story, is you had Feast, was a player who no one knew, and he made it, and he actually made it to the round of 8 of the tournament. So that's a success story there. But the downside, if you're looking at it as a purist who wants to see the best players, is that a bit like where I was saying how you're kind of determining who will be in the final by in theory, the smallest sample size part of the tournament, the group stage. It's a similar thing with the qualifier, because the qualifier is so huge because you have to run this many players that parts of it, I think, start out best of 1. And then even towards the end, I believe it's best of 3, and it's online, and sometimes cross-server matches. And when you add all these things in, almost every single time, you get weaker players than if you had some kind of LAN qualifier or you had some kind of direct invitation. So what I'm essentially asking is this, like, is it worth the trade-off of getting the one Feast every now and then, if every single time QXC always qualifies, Grubby qualifies, but for example, some incredible Korean player doesn't qualify, or Nanawa doesn't qualify, or Scarlet doesn't qualify? How do you view the balance there? Is it really worth it for that?
Not in the short run, not for the show. It's not worth it. Simple as that, it's not worth it. The best thing to do would probably be what MLG did, if you want to have a good show. What MLG did, which is handpick the best players, or the most famous players. I'm sorry, not best player is a very relative thing.
Sure.
I mean, but it's a short-term way of looking at it, in my opinion. Where if these guys, where else will these guys get the chances to to become professional and justify the spending so much time playing Starcraft if they don't ever get to a tournament. It's something we've paid for, actually. People at some point, we've iterated our tournament structure so that it would actually be more and more exciting for people. It was a balance that we had to come up with, where we would balance the qualifiers. Now we have invitations as in you apply, we think, okay, you're worthy, you come, but you have to pay your own flight still.
Okay.
That's kind of the philosophy we took. If I want to have the most viewed tournament tomorrow, I will handpick whoever's hot today and get the best commentators. But that's a very short-term way of thinking, where the same guys over and over will keep getting exposure and money, and the guys that have the talent to potentially beat them someday, they never get a shot. So for us, and it's something we've suffered for, and it's something I wouldn't have done as idealistically. It's a way of determining and giving a shot to players. And even if Stefano didn't qualify, maybe he tried 5 times to qualify to random Intel Extreme Masters tournaments.
Yeah.
We know he is probably the best player out of the lot. But we also see the value of somebody, let's say Vortex, having the experience of playing a high stakes game in his perception, a high stakes game against Stefano, and having that experience. Otherwise, I mean, Stefano doesn't play Go for Cups. So yeah, we suffer, and we suffered for that approach. And for Katowice, actually, if I were to pick the players who I wanted from the open qualifiers, none of the names that made it in would have been handpicked by me. Yeah. But that's a trade-off we're willing to suffer in order to extend the length of our ability to make use of Starcraft as a show.
Because the thing is, when you present it like that, and I've heard you make similar philosophical points, it is a very philosophical idea. It's like, I have an ideal, and then I'm going to build everything off that ideal. It will inform each decision, okay?
I mean, we started off, and it's my fault completely, too close to the idealistic side,
yeah,
and not close enough to the show side, where we basically, the community at some point, they weren't talking about us as a super premier experience.
Sure.
Now we're coming back to that, partly because of many factors, but partly because we've iterated and we've adapted our approach a little bit.
So my question on this as a follow-up would be, is it possible to go a bit further away from the ideal then? Because the way I think of it is like this. I remember when it was entirely open qualifiers. So if you were, well, I'll just say it like this. If you were white, you had to qualify online and win your qualifier. But at the time, you didn't hold Korean qualifiers. You used to handpick some Koreans who were available, and they had to be able to send themselves on that.
So how it was actually GSL had almost exclusivity on the Koreans.
Okay.
And we were, at the time, we simply had to ask them if they could lend us players.
Sure.
So there was not even a choice then.
Did that not compromise the ideal a little bit then? That this
yes,
guy
it did.
just
Yes,
gets invited and he has to qualify?
Yes, it did, but we didn't have any other choice. We either would have to say no Koreans at all,
yeah,
or Koreans that were made available to us. So we didn't have a choice in that sense.
Because on this topic, I think an obvious topical thing that I haven't heard anyone ask you about, you once made this joke video for April Fools that you were banning all Koreans. And it was a joke at the time, but people have actually suggested similar things at the end of last year as a real thing. And you're obviously in a position where potentially you could be involved with making such a decision. Now, for the show, maybe it would be better, some people would argue, if you had mainly foreigners. Maybe that would have interest. I don't know myself. But if you're so open to the idea of the open qualifier and whoever's good gets to qualify, you will always be against region locking then, surely. Isn't that the philosophical follow-on?
Yes and no again. In this, one thing that you mentioned, I want to just say, relevance is one of the main drivers of viewership, not necessarily skill actually. If somebody tells you that the Kings, that's hockey, that these two Australian teams are the best hockey teams in the world, and they really are, you'll probably still watch Kings rather. Perhaps. Because they're more relevant to you. So that's a factor. When it comes to designing how Starcraft should look like, I think we're too far down the hole to turn back. There has been a standard established by the industry. The industry regulated itself that there is a big expectation that you need to have a lot of Korean players. I think it's for the worse, to be honest, because bringing so many Koreans to the MLGs, to the IPLs, in a way which I don't consider ecosystem natural, because those players were brought by the organizers to the events rather than had the sponsorship to come in.
Sure, yeah.
Resulted in the fact that money was won, taken out of the ecosystem, back to Korea, and the people that won the money, the natives, I don't know a good word for it, but you know what I mean. The North Americans, the Europeans, they didn't win enough money or gain enough exposure for a lot of them to be able to justify the hours that the Koreans were able to put in. So it was actually draining the North America, Europe not so much, but North America. It was draining North America of excuses for North Americans to practice as hard as everyone else, creating an ecosystem where only a real handful were actually full-time and had an excuse, were able to justify putting in the hours. By that I mean had the money to not worry about studying or having a day job or something like that. That creates a small player pool that practices on that server with each other, and I believe you're only as good as the pool of players that you practice, and it's a freak occurrence if somebody's really good in a environment of a tiny pool of players. That takes an immense talent and immense dedication, way above anyone else. If we have a North American champion today, Scarlet is a bit of a freak occurrence because it's a relatively weak region with a small practice pool. I mean, you need to be able to, if we talk in Starcraft terms, counter a very wide, diverse array of playing styles. It's not enough that you have different playing styles, they have to be completely top refined playing styles, right? The smaller that pool is, the worse you can be as a player, or the less you are prepared for as a player. Now, if you're a genius, able to think on your feet better than anyone else, it doesn't bother you at all. But not everyone is that kind of genius. Some people rely on mechanics, for example. You can have a perfectly mechanically sound foreigner and he will not be able to cope with the new strategy or with the varieties dealt with the Koreans, who probably there are probably 60 Koreans who can win a tournament on a good day. That's a big practice pool too, variety and a consistently high skill level. That's what they have. So I think overall the way the Starcraft industry developed was that we went there too soon, and it took away, it crippled actually North America to a large degree as a source of players that would come in. And I would have preferred the process to be slower and ecosystem natural, where the Koreans that actually have a sponsorship, or maybe the very few that play for SK Gaming, they come in. It's a great experience for the North Americans to compete against super high skilled Koreans. No, I mentioned North Americans, but Europeans alike. Sure, yeah. And they have to be in those tournaments, the Koreans, to compete, for Dimaga to compete against a MC or against a Jaedong. That's experience you're not able to buy, but you need to really balance it properly. And I think if it was balanced in a ecosystem natural way, where the Koreans that have the sponsorship should go to a DreamHack, to a MLG, something like that, then I think there would have been more development of player talent in Europe and North America, and the longevity of Starcraft would be longer. I mean, North America is not in the best shape these days for Starcraft.
So people will, part of the reason why this debate gets brought up a lot is because, like you're saying with the relevance, okay, people say they want someone to cheer for. So someone from Canada probably wants Scarlet or Hawk, someone, a big name they can identify, they want that person to do well. But an area where I find it confusing when people present the argument like that, like we have to do something to help North America or help Europe or limit the Korean dominance, is that it implies that the people really want to see these North Americans. And so as a result, if the market really does regulate itself, then why doesn't IEM do a tournament with Koreans, okay? And it makes it less interesting in this world, in this particular model. But then, for example, some company comes along and they say, well, we're gonna only do North Americans. All of our tournaments are only North American. In which case, if this holds true, the viewing figures should be higher, in which case IEM would think, maybe we should do that. But I don't see that happening. I think there must be a reason as to why no one holds these tournaments that would have Idra, that would have, you know, all the people that people wanted to see a year ago. Why doesn't that exist, and why is that not being catered to in the market if that really exists, this need for it?
I think it's a Total Biscuit organized a North America only event, and it had really good viewership, considering, I mean, it exceeded all my expectations. It could happen. It could be true, but we are, I think, in the industry too far down the hole again, where people, people are torn a little bit between, I want to see the very best, and everybody knows who the best players are, and everyone knows what the gap is, versus I want to see the relevant ones, the ones close to my home, for example. I think that the industry has established itself way too much. For example, LCS in America. Riot is regulating it in a way where the relevant guys are kept in a pool with themselves, and the viewership is extremely high. But I think if there had been a really massive global league where everybody was mixed, and then you try to go back and chop it up into regions, then that's something you can't come back from. If you have a global mix of players and that becomes the standard, it's very difficult, in my opinion, to come back from it and reverse it and make it regional again, if that makes any sense. Especially that in the beginning you had how many players in North America? It would have been so, well viewed, I think. You had Idra in control, Tyler, Machine, so many players that were close to each other, and between them, they were all names relevant. You had these Canadians, Kiwi Kaki was good, creative, Huck. I could probably name, maybe if I thought hard enough, 16 players who in 2010, everybody would be super excited if they had a major trophy to fight for in North America. So that was one theoretical avenue where the industry took a turn away from it, and I don't think there's going back from it. But had the industry, I think MLG aimed for monopoly in Starcraft, which is why they decided, let's have the show that nobody will be able to compare themselves with. Had they decided, hey, let's have the best possible show, with some Koreans peppered in, let's have a great North American show, they would have had great viewership as well, I think. But then they wouldn't have had the leadership role that they had at some point. So I think it's just a turn of the industry that you go either right or left at the fork, and there's no going back. That's, I think, how it stands with Starcraft.
In my interviews, I always center around like ideas about the game and the game. I will very rarely ever make a political point, but I have a political analogy for you with something you talked about. Okay, so you framed it in this way of this ecosystem of money, and we'll use North America just because it's quicker than saying North America and Europe every time, okay? North America, okay, this is the one doing the worst at the moment. And like you're saying, if MLG has tournaments, then if a Korean comes over and he wins that money, he goes back to Korea, he takes it out of the ecosystem, and because he's so much better, which in some ways we could argue maybe he plays harder, he practices harder, he's more dedicated, he's then taking money away from people who are in North America who would have won it if it was a North American only tournament. And as a result, they will say, well, I'm not going to practice as much, or there isn't a motivation for me, okay?
Well, it's not about motivation, it's about, I think it's about simply paying the bills, you know?
Okay.
If you don't have the ability to pay your bills with Starcraft, then you simply find a job and play less. And it's a vicious circle when it's spiraling down.
Okay.
That's how I see it.
Because
and don't get me wrong, the Koreans that win that money, they deserve it. They deserve every cent.
Sure.
You know, it's not like they don't deserve it. And it's not like we should give special protection to North American players, but I don't think we should give privileges to players who are better simply because they are simply on the ground that, like, if you're better, great, but if you're better than me in StarCraft, a tournament should still treat us equally.
Okay.
That's how I feel. But you shouldn't be getting privileges because you're privileged, and your privileged situation is still being reinforced if you keep receiving privileges for being better.
But when you gave that analogy of the ecosystem and money coming out, so I'll actually use our two nationalities here. So you're from Poland and I'm from England. And there was a trend, I think it started about maybe like half a decade ago, where because of the EU regulations where you could move freely between countries, there was a famous cliche that all these Polish people came to England, understandably so, because there's a certain minimum wage, and if you wanted a very simple job, not a classy job, like picking potatoes was the famous one, then the Polish person would come in, he would take that job, and whatever the money was worth, I think like £5 an hour, to what he could have made in Poland, this was good money, and so he thought, I didn't have a job in Poland, I've got a job in England now, this is good money for what I'm making, I'll work hard at that, I want this job. But unemployment is high among English people, okay? And so they would complain and say, oh, this person's coming in, he's taking my job, but that person really, they didn't want to pick potatoes, they wanted a good job doing something they did. So they're in a way, we would say they're lazy, okay? They're not as dedicated. Isn't this the same sort of a scenario? If this Korean guy, he's willing to practice so hard and he's gonna come over, is it a problem that he then takes the money? Isn't he more dedicated? Isn't he deserving of it more than the person who's like, oh, if I could,
100%
I could get
correct.
that?
You're 100% correct. 100% correct. But Britain didn't fly these Poles over to London, to wherever, to get those jobs. They made it open.
Sure.
You know, the market regulated itself. If a British person doesn't want to pick potatoes, there's a void, somebody will come in.
Yeah.
Right? What happened in North America was that the show organizers paid for those Koreans to come, you know. I actually, at the time when Slayer's Boxer was sponsored by Intel, I wanted him at an IEM event, and Intel Global talked to Intel Korea about potentially getting him, and we got a price tag of, okay, it's going to cost you $25,000 to bring him.
Yeah.
Now, you know, Slayer's Boxer went to North America to a couple of events.
And first prize was only $5,000 at those tournaments.
So think about that. So it's completely fine if the prize money is open for the Koreans for the taking, but if you fly them over, you're actually messing with the ecosystem, you know? You're messing with the natural balance of where the money goes in the industry, if that makes any sense.
Okay. Well, I have another point to relate to the idea of qualifiers in this open system. So you were saying, actually, currently, as long as the person can pay themselves, then there is invitations. And so a famous example was when someone dropped out, Revival got to go to the IEM, which set up this drama with Nanoat, etc. So there are invitations being used. And so I could see a hybrid between the two philosophies here, which is that if you're going to use the invitations and you want it to be good players, and they're still open, most of the tournament's open for the good players, the problem has always been in the industry, people will say, okay, but how would you seed? How would you really know who the fourth best player is, okay? Because they all play in different tournaments. But actually, something like tennis that I gave as an example before, it's actually a misnomer rather, that every tennis player plays in every tournament and that's how ranking works. it's actually ranked based, I think, on like which players play, and then some person plays in Cincinnati and this person plays in Miami, but then we use the overall seeding from all these tournaments to decide where we're ranked when we both play French Open, you know. Can we not have something like this? Because what I don't understand is, okay, maybe IEM in the past would have said, well, our IAM ranking is whoever won the World Championship is number one, and this.
Yeah.
Could you not just do a version where you take everyone's results and you just decide the role?
We used WCS points for our invitations, actually.
So the highest player who can go and send himself from WCS could come?
Yeah, so for example, if Innovation was the leader, if he chooses to go to IEM events, he's invited every single time. So that's how we did it this season. So actually, I like the fact that you mentioned tennis. I think personally, my personal view is that's the most suitable model for esports overall, considering that there are many independent organizers that probably don't even want to hold hands with each other, to be completely honest with you. Or let's say are very apprehensive because there is not 100% trust between all of them. You know, there are some digs on Twitter every now and then, coming from the north sometimes, from the west, from the south. So I'm a big fan of the tennis system, actually, for the current or the ecosystem of esports that we've known for the last 8 or 10 years.